Trust is a value that undergirds every step of social progress, right here locally, nationally, and globally. You know, just think about it. You know, when we want to have those deep conversations where perhaps we don't agree with each other, but we want those conversations to understand one another. Trust needs to be there. And when we build relationships, trust has to be part of it. And then if we're a negotiator, whether it's on a small local level, whether you're helping in some way locally, or whether it's national or on the world stage, trust needs to be part of those negotiations. That's why I'm so happy you've all come today, so that I hope by tonight, when you go home, you'll have some new ideas to think about trust in a different way. Because I think we're all looking for that force for good, aren't we? Not just for ourselves, but we want to see that force for good out there in the world for everyone. We want to see it working. We don't want something that's here today and gone tomorrow. We want something that we can solidly plant our feet on, that we can turn to 24/7, that's reliable, that gives us courage as we move forward. So I'm going to share some promises with you today that have been around for millennia. And my family have relied upon them for generations, and I'm going to share some of our stories with you. And those promises come from the Bible. Now, the Bible is a book that has sold more copies than any other book in the world. It's over 5 billion copies now. And when you speak to somebody new that's just picked up the Bible for the first time, they'll tell you that those words that they read, perhaps from the Psalms, still comfort them. That the stories within the Bible have a relevance even to today. So we're going to look at those Bible promises that are there through the lens of Christian Science. And my shorthand for that, for the moment, is that law of good, that force for good that we want to see out in the world. So before we go any further, I want to give some context in case some of you may not know very much about Christian Science. Well, it all culminated in the publication of this book, Science and Health, with Key to the Scriptures, by Mary Baker Eddy in 1875. Now, for a woman to write a serious book at that time period was groundbreaking. Women were writing, some women seriously, but most were writing poetry and fiction and including their serious ideas into their poetry and fiction. But Mary Baker Eddy wrote this book on science, theology, and medicine, and it created quite some waves at the time. So why would we want to talk about a woman in the United States? What relevance has that to us today? Why should we care about this? Mary Baker Eddy was born at a time when women, both here in the United Kingdom and in the United States, were not able to plot their own course. They were under the care of a father, a husband, a brother, a male member of the family. Some did plot their courses. There were exceptions. But for most women, they were struggling to find a sense of freedom for themselves, both mentally and often physically. Mary Baker Eddy was no exception. She was born into a rural farming community in New England, and for the first 14 years of her life lived there with her parents, her 5 siblings, extended family, It was a working farm. They were growing their own food, making materials for their own clothing, and selling the excess to market. So it was a busy home that she lived in. But she was struggling with ill health. Her parents really were quite concerned about her, not knowing whether she would survive beyond her childhood. She was also struggling for that sense of freedom in herself. She felt she was meant to do something with her life. She told friends even at that early age that she was going to write a book. I'm not sure that they felt that she was going to do that, but she definitely knew that there was something within her that was compelling her to think big for her life. Now, as was the custom in New England at the time, families came together at least once a day to read from the Bible. And then the head of the household, the father, would preach about the words that he just read. And that was true in Mrs. Eddy's home, and that's how she began to know the Bible herself and get to know those Bible promises that we're going to talk about. But it also led her to question things because of this sense of wanting to move forward. She questioned her father and the minister at her church. What was this divine presence that she was reading about in the Bible? Was it a judgmental God, a vengeful God that she heard her father preach about? She wasn't sure about that. When she looked around her at the experience of her own family, you can imagine what 6 brothers and sisters were like. They didn't all agree. And it was her mother's unconditional love that brought that unity to the family. That's the expression of love that she began to equate with the divine. So she began to question, what is God? You know, sometimes the arguments grew quite strong with her father, and she didn't always feel well afterwards. Her mother would come to her and tell her to lean on God's love, to trust her faith in God. And then if she did that, and when she did that, she found that physically she felt well again. You know, there was that sense that she was pushing hard here. And sometimes people have written about Mary Baker Eddy that she was willful. And perhaps many women of the day were that way when they were trying to find answers. But her biographer, Robert Peel, wrote this. He said, "These arguments have sometimes been presented as simply a clash of wills. But what they may well have involved at the deepest level was the shock of struggle over existential concerns, freedom and destiny, meaning and truth." And you can imagine, as a young woman, not knowing whether she was going to survive very much longer, she was really wrestling with those questions about why was she here? What was she supposed to do? Well, it took her another 4.5 decades until she could answer some of those questions. So we're going to leave her story there, and I'll come back to it a little bit later on. What I think one of her most greatest contributions was, and is the definition of God in this book. When I was living in England and in high school, one day our teacher asked us how many of us believed in God. A few of us put our hands up. And then he said, "Well, what do you believe God is?" And the other 5 girls that had put their hands up didn't quite know how to answer. They said, "Well, God's a mystery. We learn about it as we get older. We'll understand more as we learn more. And that was the moment that I realized what a treasure I had had in learning what this definition was at an early age in Sunday school. Because I already felt I had a relationship with God. I had seen it proved in my life. I'd seen that love of God. I'd seen the healing power of God in my family. So I really feel that this is going to be the base of what we talk about today. So I'm going to read you that definition so you're clear about it. She writes, God, the great I am. And we know that I am was the name that God gave to Moses when Moses asked him, well, what shall I call you? I am, meaning one God, one divine presence, all presence, one cause, one being. And she goes on, the all-knowing, all-seeing, all-acting, all-wise, all-loving and eternal, principle, mind, soul, spirit, life, truth, love, all substance, intelligence. You know, she didn't pick those words out of the air. Those are the words that she found within the Bible as she began to read it for herself. Yes, the Bible defines God as a spirit. It defines God as love. But those other words that she uses, you can find right there in the Bible. Let's take one of them, mind, for example. I'm going to read a Bible promise from Paul's letter to the Romans. Paul was a follower of Jesus a few decades after Jesus' resurrection, but he had heard that teaching, and here he is describing that sense of intelligence that is the divine. He says, "Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and his ways past finding out." And then he quotes Job from the Hebrew Bible. "For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has become his counselor? For of him and through him and to him are all things." So again, bringing out that sense of allness, that all presence, all power, all knowledge, all action. You know, I think we understand that, excuse me, we're not just within a framework of what we see with our eyes and what we hear with our ears. We know that we can move beyond that. And when we think of mind and intelligence, just think of the laws of mathematics, the laws of aerodynamics. You know, those laws have been there forever. They haven't just appeared. They've always been there for us to use. It's just we've had to find our way to use them in different ways. You know, I expect most of you are like me. You just know enough about mathematics to use it every day. But there might be somebody here who's a professor of mathematics that uses it in a different way, in a grander way than perhaps some of us know. And you know, look at what we've done with that knowledge. We've been able to travel into space. We've been able to, as we've grown in our understanding, put telescopes into space so we can see beyond where we are now. So we know that those laws are there. Now, my husband helped me understand this a little better because Before he retired, he was a computer software engineer. And his company created a package that was sold to different companies. And his job was to customize this package to whatever the industry was that bought it, whether it was an underground system, whether it was a government or a factory. So he had to know the business that they were in and then customize this package. Well, sometimes it was easy. He only had to just write some more programming and that would suffice. But he said there were times when there was nothing that had been written before in computer science or in mathematics that could help him understand how to customize it. So I said, well, what do you do? And he said, I just wait. I wait for that idea to come to thought that I can take and use and begin to see, test it out, add it to what I understand of math and computer science, and see how I can customize that package. And he said that idea always came. It sometimes took a while, but it always came. So we do have those instances in our lives where we see that we can push through those barriers that seem to define us, seem to set themselves as limits in our lives. So let's talk about another name for God, and that's love. The Bible tells us that God is love. It doesn't mean a human sense of love, the in and out, on and off, hot and cold sense of love that we all know. The sense of, well, if I like you, maybe you'll like me back. Or if I love you, maybe you'll love me. No, we're talking about a sense of love that is so great and so big, that's that all power, that fills all space, that has no edges, that has no other side to it. Nothing can oppose it. It doesn't have to make something into love because it already is love. That's the kind of love we're talking about when we're talking about God's love. So this time for a Bible promise, I'm going to the Hebrew Bible and I'm going to Deuteronomy. And it says here, when it's talking about God and his creation, it says, he encircled him. He instructed him. He kept him as the apple of his eye. As an eagle stirs up its nest, hovers over its young, spreading out its wings, taking them up, carrying them on its wings, so the Lord alone led him. Now, those of you that know about eagles know that when the mother is helping the babies learn to fly, she flies underneath them. They can't fall because they fall on her wings and she takes them back up to safety until they're ready to fly again. So just think about that sense of love for yourself. When you're going through a dark time, when you're trying a new adventure, a new challenging activity, that law of love, those wings are right underneath you. You can't fail. God's love is right there for you at that moment. Now, I could go on and we could talk about all those names for God that Mrs. Eddy mentions, but we don't have time for that tonight. But that just gives you a taste of how Mary Baker Eddy came to understand this new definition of God. You know, I wanted to share an experience with you that shows how someone came to trust that law of good, that law of love, completely in their own lives. And when I thought about it, I thought about my grandmother. She was 17 when she got married, and it was an arranged marriage. And by the time she was 19, she had 2 small children. And this, by the way, all took place not far from here in Wallasey. And when, just after those 2 children were born, she fell ill. And a doctor was called, and he tried to treat her the best he could. It just was not working. She was not improving. And her mother was called to come and help nurse her and take care of the children. And the doctor told her that she had spinal meningitis and that there was no hope for her recovery. Maybe she had a week to live. Well, I think you can imagine my great-grandmother was just reaching out with everything she knew how. She did not want to see her daughter die. She did not want to see those little boys grow up without their mother. Now, my great-grandmother had been given a copy of this book by a friend who said to her that for her the Bible had seemed really strange. She hadn't understood it. And when she began to read Mary Baker Eddy's book, it began to make sense to her. She began to understand the laws that were there, undergirding everything within the Bible. And she said, I understand how healing can happen today, because Jesus told us that if we believed on him, we could do the same works that he did, and even greater than he did. So one morning she said to my gran, do you think this is our answer? Do you think reading this book, trying to understand this, will help us? And my gran said, you know, I know that Jesus said that we only have to have a tiny bit of faith, like a mustard seed. And if we have that, we can move mountains. But she said, I don't feel like I have that kind of faith. I don't know where to get it, and I don't feel well enough to try. Now, my great-gran knew that it wasn't reliant on finding it. It was there already, and all they had to do was see it. So she did the next thing that she knew, and she called a Christian Science practitioner to help them, to try and help them understand more about what this book was telling them. Now, a Christian Science practitioner is someone that takes calls from the public 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And they can be on any subject that life throws at us, whatever problem life is throwing at us. It could be a health issue, but it could also be perhaps you're not getting on well with a friend or a spouse, and you need some new ideas of how to look at that situation. It could be you've lost your job and you need to find a new way to put bread on the table for your family. The practitioner doesn't take names and problems and beseech God to intervene on those people's behalf. What the practitioner is doing is going to those Bible promises, thinking about what the divine is, learning more about how that law of good works, how it's active in our lives and can be proved by everyone that uses it. And the practitioner is then bringing these fresh ideas to each case that they're working with. And in my grandmother's case, she asked her to get her Bible and to read the 91st Psalm with an open mind. Well, when my gran heard that, she thought, how can a psalm heal me when I'm so sick? And then she thought in the next breath, well, that's not being very open, is it? I need to listen to what this practitioner is telling me. I've asked her to help me, and I should listen. So she got her Bible, and she thought to herself, well, what does an open mind mean? It means I have to let go of everything that's in thought right now. Let it go. And to read this with a listening ear. To just kind of listen to those words and see what direction they give me. So she began to read. So here's our next promise. He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, he is my refuge and my fortress. My God, in him I will trust. He shall cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you shall take refuge. Well, I think you can imagine that as she read those first verses, she began to feel that sense of protection and care that they bring out. You know, if you know the 91st Psalm, and I'm sure a lot of you do, you know it talks about lots of things that can assail us, hurt us, and that shadow of the Almighty is there to protect us, to keep us safe from harm. And then she felt that sense of love, that nestled in feathers, being covered in God's care and love. That's what stood out to her as she read that psalm. Now, she didn't read just those few verses, she read all 16 of them. By the time she got to the end, she knew something had happened to her. She called to her mother in the next room, and her mother ran in because she knew something had changed, because she hadn't heard her speak beyond a whisper in over a week. And there she was, getting out of bed, able to take care of her children with no recovery period at all. It was a turning point for my grandmother, turning away from what society and her family, how they had mapped out her life at that point, to a total trust in that divine presence that had healed her. And she needed it. Her husband didn't survive much longer beyond this period of time, and she was left with those two little boys to bring up and to educate them, to find work for herself, all at a time when there were no social safety nets. And that's what she did. And as I watched her long life, I saw her never waver from that sense of trust, in that sense of divine love that the Bible brought to her in those early days. Now, of course, my father was one of those little boys, so of course he brought that sense of reliance into our home. And we were always encouraged, whether it was a health issue, whether it was a school report that had gone wrong or a career decision, we were always encouraged to turn to that divine sense of intelligence. Turn to it and listen for the direction before we did anything else. And now it's come into my home. So it's something that has had a long history through our family, right from that very first healing of my grandmother's. And I think what that practitioner was helping her to understand was that she did have to let go of that fear of what was going to happen to her and her family at that point, which was very real, as you can imagine, and really begin to yield to that divine presence of love for everything she needed. So these qualities of God, these names for God that we've talked about already, they never change. They're always there for us to rely on. We can turn to them and trust them. Once we begin to do that, then we begin to want to understand our own relationship to that divine presence. And when I think of that, I think of Jesus and his relationship to that divine presence of love, to what he called his Father, but we might say Father, Mother, when we read those wonderful passages in the Bible that bring out that mothering sense of God. He was always at one with that sense of love. Whether it was where he had to go, what he had to say, his healing ministry, he always turned to it when he needed it. One of his teachings very much was to see that we were never separated from that sense of love, ever. And you can see when he was talking to the crowds, it didn't matter to him whether you were a woman or a man, whether you were young or old, whether you were sick or healthy, or whether you came from the top echelons of society like a Roman commander, or whether you were a social outcast. It was all the same to him. As he preached, he was laying out a new path for people to follow. He was saying, here it is. This is how you live your life. You don't just look at the path, you get on it. And you need to learn these new teachings. And he included everyone in that. It was the same in his healing work. He didn't check up with their friends. Well, is this person that's come to me worthy of being healed? Shall I heal them? He didn't triage the situation and heal the sickest first and then move down the line to the less sick. He healed all that came to him. He was showing us that we couldn't be separated from that love, that it was a healing love that came to us. And I'm going back to that letter to the Romans because Paul, again, he describes that in such a beautiful way. This is decades later when he writes, I am persuaded that neither death nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor height, nor depth, nor any other created thing shall be able to separate us from the love of God. So again, just think about how wonderfully deep that is when we're going through a dark time in our lives, a bleak time perhaps, things don't seem to be going the way we think they should. But to know that we're not alone, that love is with us. It's always going to be with us. Another teaching that's so important is that we all have access to this sense of good, that we all are children of God, all of us, not anyone is left out. And I see that as a golden thread that runs through the Bible. If we start in Genesis, in the first chapter, it tells us that God made us in his image and likeness. So if I took a picture with my camera right now, you know, the picture I see in my camera is exact to what I'm looking at out there. So if we're the image of God, we have to be the same as God. We have to be expressing those same qualities that God has. That love of love, that honesty and integrity of truth, that sense of life that doesn't have a beginning and an ending, that's eternal, that sense of mind that's intelligent and infinite, and go on. So image and likeness, we're the same as that. That is how God made us. That's our spiritual substance. If we go on to the Psalms, the psalmist said that he won't be satisfied until he awakes in God's likeness. He's not satisfied with being in this kind of material world with limits, that just what we see or hear. He's saying that he's not going to be satisfied until he awakes in that image and likeness of God. Jesus taught Nicodemus late at night, who was a Pharisee. He came to him and said, I've heard you preaching. I want to know more. I want to understand what you're saying. What more do I have to do? And Jesus says, You have to be born not just of the flesh, but of the Spirit. And then he goes on to explain what spirit is, that it's beyond our physical senses, that it's out there like the wind. We can feel its effect, but it's not tangible in the same sense. And then Paul writes about putting off that old man and putting on the new man, that sense of God as our image and likeness. You know, this is how Jesus healed. He wasn't seeing a sick person who couldn't walk, or someone who was immoral, or someone who was cheating their neighbor on their taxes. He was lifting his thought from that physical sense of individuals to that image and likeness of God, to their full potential. Mary Baker Eddy writes about this in her book. She says this, that Jesus prayed. He withdrew from the material senses to refresh his heart with brighter, with spiritual views. Now, that's not what the world tells us, is it? It says that we're subject to our parents' DNA, and so we inherit whatever we have from our parents, or whatever our upbringing is, for good or bad, that has an effect on who we are. Or we're subject to chance, that at any moment something could change. Or even that as we age, it's inevitable that we physically decline. Now, all those beliefs come from that sense of physical limitation. And what we're trying to do is look beyond that. So another way I'm going to describe it to you is, supposing we go out and go down the road a bit and look at that beautiful ocean in front of us. Well, it's a sea, the Irish Sea, right ahead of us. But supposing we could stand there and just look at it with the horizon in the distance and just that blueness of the water. It's so big and encompassing that that's like that power of love of God. But I could go on the beach, I could pick some water up in my hand, and we're like those individual drops of water. I can put them right back, and we're whole again with that sense of love. We're not God, we're not the whole, but we're those individual drops of water. And those drops of water have the same characteristics as the whole ocean. So again, we're that image and likeness of God. Well, I had to learn this lesson. I had to learn that there were not two of me. One that was this physical being that was trying to be better, trying to be more spiritual, and the spiritual one that was up here somewhere that I couldn't quite reach. I was out one summer day with my husband, and we were cutting back the undergrowth at the front of our house. And it had overgrown, and so then we were carrying it to the back to burn on the bonfire. Well, in America, we have this thing called poison ivy, which is a plant. And when you cut it, it releases an oil. And that oil seems to affect people in different ways. Some people, it doesn't affect them very much, but others, they have a severe reaction to it. And by the evening, because it was summer, I was just in my t-shirt and carrying these bundles of stuff around the back. My arms were in agony. I couldn't do anything. And over the next couple of days, it just got worse. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat, I was sensitive to noise and to light, and then my arms needed bandaging. And I'm used to, as I said, turning to this divine presence of love for healing and seeing quick results. And here I wasn't seeing quick results. I was kind of buried in what was going on in the body, what it was telling me. Was it better? Was it worse? So I knew at that point I needed some help. And so I called a Christian Science practitioner to help me. And immediately she was there telling me, you've got to make a choice. She said, you are spiritual. You are made of spiritual substance. And she began to list qualities like, you're very loving, you're compassionate, you're a very honest person. And she went on telling me how she identified me spiritually. And then she said, those qualities, that's you. She said, they can't be touched by an oil. They're the same as they were yesterday, and they're going to be the same tomorrow, and that's who you are. You can't have clean water and dirty water in the same place. You can't be two things at once. You have to make a choice. And she kept lifting my thought up to that sense of spirit. Well, I asked some Christian Science nurses to help me too, because I felt that while I was working with the practitioner, it would be helpful if they took care of me physically. They bandaged my arms, did whatever was needed, and I could keep my thought buoyed up with the practitioner's help. And I knew they would see me in the same light as the practitioner. They were looking at me in just the same way. So that's what we did. And on the weekend, one of my friends, who was a Christian Science nurse, asked me to go to her apartment. She wanted to nurse me there. Well, as I walked into it, I felt this overwhelming sense of love. It was huge. I was awed by it. And it was a bit like this quote on the wall from Mary Baker Eddy, where it says that divine love always has met and always will meet every human need. And I felt that God had placed me there and that every one of my needs was going to be met. I knew my friend was a loving person, but I knew that love had its source in divine love, that she was reflecting, expressing that love in the way she cared for me. And indeed, she made lovely meals. She sat with me and encouraged me to eat. She bandaged my arms. When I was in pain, she sat with me and we read together from the Bible and from Science and Health, and she lifted my thought up. She even made me laugh at times to kind of break that mesmeric hold that wants to keep you focused on the body. Well, the next day was Sunday, and she had to go to church to take care of some duties there. And she said to me, you know, it would continue to help you if you went to church. Do you know that was the last thing I wanted to do? My body was so swollen that I couldn't fit in my own clothes. And I just didn't want anyone to see me looking the way that I was looking at that moment. But off she went. She didn't try to push me. She just left that seed there and off she went. Well, I walked into the next room, and on the bed, she had laid her own clothes out for me in the most beautiful order, with a sense of love and grace that touched me deeply. I just found myself putting the clothes on, and I went to church. And she was right. That healing service was it just helped to continue to lift my thought up about myself. The singing, the music, the words that I heard from the Bible and Mrs. Eddy's writings, it just was just so wonderful. I felt lighter somehow. That's what I felt. And as I was leaving the church, a friend saw me. She wasn't expecting to see me there. And she said, why don't we go for a walk, she said. And I just did. I didn't even think twice about it. We went off for a beautiful walk. It was a summer's day. And when I got back to my friend's apartment, my husband called me and said, oh, when are you coming home? We need you at home, and there was this feeling, And I could say, come now. I knew that although my body hadn't changed, that I was healed. And I went home, and within a day I was back at work and my body was back to normal. This was just so helpful in helping me understand a clearer sense of who I was and what my spiritual substance was. You know, every small demonstration we make with this law of good, how we prove it, builds on the next, one after the other, until we see that we really can trust this. And when we begin to understand who we are, where our origin comes from, this image and likeness of God, then we're going to understand that we can trust each other because we all have that same origin. Everybody has that same origin. We can look at it and recognize it in each other. It's kind of like that great commandment that Jesus gave us, where he summarized all the commandments. He said, first of all, we have to love God with all our heart, with all our mind, with all our soul. And then we have to love our neighbor as ourselves. First, we have to understand who we are so we can love our neighbors as ourselves. Well, I can almost hear you saying, but there's such a mess out there. There's so many problems in the world that are insurmountable, that don't seem to be getting fixed. We often hear in the States of thoughts and prayers are not enough. We need action. That's not enough. So how do we think about that? You know, I go back to Jesus, to that time period, because that was when the Romans were occupying the Jews' homeland. It was a very brutal regime, and the Jews were longing to be free. They were searching in the Bible itself to see what it promised them. It was saying there was going to be a savior that was going to save them from this. I'm sure they hoped it was a Moses or a Joshua, a military commander that would come and wipe those Romans off the face of the earth. But that wasn't what Jesus was teaching. Jesus was showing that path. Here's the path. This is what you have to be on. And then he shared those two wonderful promises with us, one from Matthew and one from Luke. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. The kingdom of God is within you. You don't have to move from where you are. You're already free. That's what he was saying. You don't have to wait 5 minutes, 50 years, or until the end of your life for a change. That change can happen right now. How did he know that? He was embodying that nature of the divine, that sense of who God was so completely. But he knew it was more than a physical person, that it was a power, a Christ power. He began to be identified as the Christ, or the anointed, the Savior, because people saw those healing works, and that wasn't usual. So they began to say, well, perhaps he is that Savior. But he was saying that saving power, that Christ power, was with Moses. It was with him right there. But it's also going to be with us forevermore. So we can turn to that Christ power for healing. That's the kind of freedom that Mary Baker Eddy was searching for. And we left her story where she was still at an early stage, seeing glimpses of that divine sense of love that healed. And she still occasionally, through the peaks and valleys that followed, saw healing. But it was inconsistent. It wasn't that a method of healing, a systematic method of healing that anyone could prove in their lives. So she was still searching at that point. There came a day when she had an accident, and when the doctor came, I think because of her frail sense of health, she'd been an invalid all those decades, he felt that she couldn't possibly survive the injuries that she sustained. And she was put to bed. Her friends had gathered in another room. Her minister had been called. She had said goodbye to him. He wasn't expecting to see her again. What did she do? That persistent thought turned her back to the Bible, and she opened it to a healing of Jesus. And it was there that she saw this is where she had to search. That was where she was going to find that law, the how of Jesus' healings. She found herself getting out of bed. She surprised her friends in the other room. And for the next 3 years, she began to search within the scriptures yet again until she was able to begin to articulate the ideas that she began to write down in Science and Health. She wanted to see that consistency, that law of good, that she could explain to others, teach them how to heal, watch them heal other people. Then she knew she was on the right track. She knew physically she was well. She saw her own life change within that 3-year period. Now, she went on at that point to found the First Church of Christ Scientists in Boston, Massachusetts. And this branch here in Hoylake is one of its branches of that mother church, we call it. She also founded a Christian Science Publishing Society to publish her books, not just Science and Health. She had other writings that she went on to write at that time. And she began to get a lot of questions from people who were beginning to read her book, Science and Health, and were beginning to heal others and themselves, but they had questions about healing. And the communication system in that time was very different to ours. So what she did was she founded a weekly magazine called the Christian Science Sentinel and a monthly one called the Christian Science Journal. And within its pages, she began answering those questions to the public. So if you're not familiar with Christian Science, I would really encourage you. We have some copies of the Bible and Mary Baker Eddy's writings outside, but we also have some contemporary magazines, the Sentinels and the Journals, that you can take, because it's really helpful to look at the contemporary ways in which people are using this science today. This is why it's called Christian Science. We're following the healings and teachings of Christ Jesus. That's the Christian sense of it. But the science is that provable part, that body of rules that is always going to be there, that every one of us can prove for ourselves. That's that law of good, that force for good that we want to see in the world today. You know, Christ Jesus showed us that path, that new way to trust in a way. And Mary Baker Eddy showed us that we can incorporate this completely into our lives. It's not just a one-off event. It's something that we can use and prove every day in small ways and big ways. Well, we're looking at many threats in front of us to world peace. We're looking locally at perhaps inequities in society. I know as I've talked to the members here that, you know, there's people at one end of the extreme that just have little opportunity, that don't seem to be able to get even the basic things that they need in life. And yet on the other end, there are people with more opportunities than they can handle. It seems that the pressure of that has left our children feeling anxious at school, a sense of mental health problems that need to be dealt with now. There's absenteeism in school. These are things that we are hearing about. And then there's the general fear that's out there. What's happening to our country? You've got elections in a couple of weeks. We have them in the States in November, and they're around the world at the moment. There's a fear of what could happen. So do we listen to what I've just said about that law of good and close our eyes to the television, shut it off, not read the newspapers? I don't think so. I think we have a role to play here. How I've thought about it recently is, in April we had that wonderful eclipse of the sun. And if you remember, the places that were on the path of it had 3 minutes of darkness. Now, we're a civilized society, and we know that the sun's going to eventually come out again. We're not like from centuries ago where they thought that it was the end of the world and maybe something was eating the sun. We know better than that. So if we see and recognize that wonderful sense of the sun as the power of God's love, that power of good in the world, we know that nothing can hide it, that eventually we're going to understand and clearly see that sense of good in our lives. You know, when you take a light into a dark room, that it begins to light that room. The darkness doesn't hide in the corner waiting to come out later. It's not an entity itself, it's an absence of light. So we need to bring that power of good into the world to dispel that sense of darkness, to get rid of those problems that seem to be continuing and going on and on and on. We have to see an end to them. So how do we do that? I think we have to recognize when we think of that sun as the power of God, of the power of good, that just like the sun's warmth and light, the sun doesn't know any darkness because it never sees it. I mean, it's shining so brightly, it never sees darkness. So if you think of that shining, then it's there for everyone. Just as we said that everybody has that access to good. No one's left out. And we have to keep knowing that, because that's not what the world tells us. It says that some have more than others, that there's an imbalance. But we have to see there's no imbalance. And then we have to trust God. Go to God first with the problem, rather than getting just swamped out with all the details of it. You know, when the disciples couldn't heal that young man that was brought to them, they asked Jesus, well, why couldn't we heal him? And Jesus said, because you don't have enough faith. So it's like my grandmother trying to figure out what faith is. We have to go beyond the mustard seed. We have to take that and grow it and understand this divine law of love that's so powerful. Prove it in our own lives so we can share it with others. And then hold that true model all the time as we're going about our day. You know, I think I've shown you that the change happens in our thinking. And I want you to go home and Google how many thoughts you have a day. You'll be shocked. So if we could only just get rid of a few of them, the ones that aren't doing us any good, and just hold on to those that really are showing us the way forward, that's going to improve our lives. And then living that spiritual substance, identifying yourself in that way, going beyond the physical sense of who you are, and maybe some problems that you're dealing with, and looking at that spiritual sense of who you are. Identify yourself that way, and think of yourself that way. and then follow Jesus' teachings. I keep saying he showed us that path. Just look in Matthew at the Sermon on the Mount. He told us how to live, how to love, how to forgive. Are we really incorporating those teachings into every aspect of our living? In our families, in our churches, in our community? Let's think about that. And then turning to the Bible, I've shared about 8 or 9 promises with you today. But if you look in the Bible, there are thousands of them. And just pick a new one every day. And if you don't understand it, use Mary Baker Eddy's book to help you understand what the Bible is revealing to your thought, that spiritual sense of what it's saying. And then prayer. Jesus told us that we need to go into the closet and shut the door. We need that time of undistracted prayer. No phones pinging, no TV blaring, just that quietness of listening with an open mind to God's love, to God's care for us and to all mankind. That's going to help us move forward. My last story today I'm going to share with you is of a friend of mine who came to live in Massachusetts from another state in the United States because she had not been able to make ends meet where she was for her family. And she felt she was in a state that had high unemployment. So she felt coming there, they would be able to get lots of new jobs. But she hadn't reckoned with that sense of the high cost of living in Massachusetts. And first of all, they couldn't find a place to live. And so they were living in the basement of a relative, herself, her husband, and 3 little children. Well, then she had an accident and she couldn't work. She wasn't able to walk for a while, and she was in a wheelchair with 3 children under the age of 5 in the basement. I think you can understand things weren't going well. And she rang up a relative in her home state and said, I think she wanted to vent. She wanted to say, well, things are just not going well. Things are not as we had planned. We spent our money coming here. What are we going to do now? And the relative said to her, well, I've had my own problems to deal with over the last few months. And you know, I found a book. I read it, and it helped me heal all my problems, find solutions to those problems. Guess what the book was? Science and Health. So she said to my friend, find a church, buy the book, and see how that book can help you. So one Sunday morning, we found her with her 3 little children on the steps of our church, waiting to come in. And we embraced her and her family. And over the next month or so, we realized that there were some deep issues there that needed to be healed. And she began to articulate them to us. First of all, that sense of poverty. She felt she was in a poverty trap that society had made, and that however many jobs they got, they would never be able to pay off their debt and be able to afford a place to live. The second thing was her relationship seemed unstable. There was not a sense of trust there. And the third thing was she'd say, well, I'm a young mom with 3 kids. How can I do any more than I'm doing? There was almost an intellectual barrier. This is as far as I can go. This is as much as I can give. So we began to sit with her. She knew the Bible. Her grandmother had brought her up and given her a Bible, read her the stories, so she was familiar with them. But we introduced her to Science and Health and began to read it with her, help her to understand how she could turn from relying on people, institutions, government handouts, moving to that sense of trust in the divine. Maybe some of these ways might help on that journey, but they're not what she needed to rely on. She needed to rely on that sense of God's love for her, that God was going to provide whatever she needed. And over the next few months, we began to see a change. After a couple of years, she wrote me a letter, and she said I could share with you what she wrote to me at that time. This is just part of it. She said that God supplied her with everything she needed to get through the toughest time. And she said it was different from the times where she had physically suffered hardship completely alone. And there were many times in her life when that had happened. She said, I can accept the good, all the massive amounts of good that have come into my consciousness, and allow myself to accept that I am loved, that God is loving me, and that if all these good things have come from him, I can accept them. And as I was thinking this, it came into my head, I don't have to suffer. I don't have to let these views that take away the goodness that God has given me rule. I can just accept God's goodness, in which there is no suffering. Now, at the beginning of this year, my friend graduated from university at the top of her class. And she moved back to her home state. Her boys are all grown now and they're self-sufficient. And she married again. And she's now about to enter a master's program in the career that she's always wanted to have since high school. So we saw all three of those areas that were outstanding at the beginning when we first began to know her. That sense of poverty that she couldn't climb out of, the sense of untrustworthy relationships was healed, and that sense of inadequacy, of not being able to go any further. All those areas have been met. It's so clear from what Mrs. Eddy writes here, and I think this is just a very helpful phrase that she has in her book here, where she says, the effect of this science is to stir the human mind to a change of base, on which it may yield to the harmony of the divine mind. That's not a passive thing, to stir the human mind to a change of base. That's action. That's what we need. So as we go forward, we have to trust this to guide us, because that sense of God's love nourishes us, it maintains us and sustains us. We can rely on it. So we need to bring that sense of light, of God's goodness, into everything we do. And remember, Jesus didn't say we were a chink of light. He said we were the light of the world. So we need to bring that light with us, whether it's to our families, to our churches, whether it's to community things that we're part of, community boards, school boards, whatever it is that we're doing in the world. Bring that light with you, because that's the light that's going to bring the solutions to the problems that we're seeing. You know, in John it says, God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. So we're not going to hold on to that sense of darkness. We're going to only see that sense of light. It multiplies, that good multiplies as we bring it. We'll see it happening around us. So just as my grandmother found her way forward all those years ago, right close here, and how my friend recently found her way forward, how it's shaping my life and continues to shape it, I know that you too can find trust in a changing world. So thanks so much for being here today. And please come up and ask any questions you might have if you want to afterwards. I'll be here for a bit. So thank you again for being here.